Welcome to One Bad Podcast. Here's your hosts, KD and Shaner.
KD, we split this episode into two episodes because there's too much to cover with this aggression era. So we were talking about recording the record and just there was a lot of craziness in that era with just trying to figure out our shit. Who are we? What do we sound like? All of that. I was going to mention last time, and I should mention him, our very first bass player, Jeff St. Germain. We have a bit of a Spinal Tap. What Spinal Tap has with drummers, we kind of have had with bass players until Granny came along. But shout to Jeff St. Germain. He came along. He got us launched. I think he played our first few shows. And you can check him out at St. Germain Guitars. He makes custom guitars and basses. So much love and thanks to Jeff for getting us going.
And I think he does not make bass guitars with less than 7 strings. I think is the
yeah, I think that's the caveat.
So
that's the caveat.
That's your thing.
But you know what? Yeah, we recorded that record, and I think some of these timelines get a little confusing to me, buddy. So hopefully you and I, between the two of us, can fill some stuff in. But I know our very first show ever was Lydia's. We played an open mic. I think we played like 5 songs. And then our very first show, like full show, was it Amigos? Is that where our very first show was?
Yeah. I think that's right. Because I remember, because at the time, so I was in law school and I tried to get everyone's like, hey, Kurt's in a band. Let's go check out his band, you know? And I think they were expecting like an easy, like a Foo Fighters kind of rock, you know? Like Foo Fighters is the white milk of rock, you know? And we were not that. We were like, as we're talking about in the last episode, like we were so much heavier, you know? And so I remember packing Amigos with, you know, our friends and a bunch of my classmates, and they were just like, I think their jaws hit the floor and not like in a blown away sort of way. But yeah, man, Lydia's was so fun because that was our first, you know, our first ever shows were acoustic, right? Which is kind of maybe seems crazy to, you know, for those that are long-term OBS fans, like the first, I think 2 or 3 shows were all just unplugged, you know, and a mix of like some cool covers and originals, you know?
Yeah, which was, you're right, it's crazy. And then I do remember we did the Amigos show, sold it out, and I think the next time we played Amigos, there may have been 15 people there. And that might be, I might be going more on the higher side with that. So, which, you know what, man, you and I talked about doing this podcast for a couple of reasons. Like, cool to like sit and chat with my bro of 20 years here and just like reminisce on this stuff. But also like, you know, I think bands starting at any time, like doesn't matter if it was the 60s, 70s, you know, 90s, now, even in the digital era, it's like, I think they go through the same growing pains to some degree, right? Like, how do you get fans? Like, you know, that first show was awesome, but you know, it was, as most brand new bands have the experience of like, all of their friends are going to come out for that first show because it's like people love to support. But then you move from like, your friends are stoked that you're doing a thing, but now it's like, how do we get real fans, right? And I think we discussed early on, because we, you know, coming from the Saskatoon scene, it was a good scene, but we also were like, we don't want to just be in the Saskatoon scene. And I think we probably, if you remember, I mean, I think we went on the road like probably in 2005, I would imagine. Like, you know, we started at the end of 2004. Then I think by 2005, I bought that little Astro van. My parents got us that first little tiny trailer. I remember somebody had, I came out of one show and somebody was having sex on one of the fenders and broke it off. Classic.
I wish we had that footage, you know?
But that speaks to that's the quality of a lot of our early shows.
Well, and you know, you make a point, I think, and this is a lesson for any upcoming band. And I say this to bands all the time. It's like 2 things you have to do to get out of your comfort zone. First, and we did this, and it was really uncomfortable for a long time. But first, you can't just rely on covers, right? Like, you know, and so how many musicians do we know that are great musicians that just leaned way too heavy on covers for so long, and then they sort of become like, they never learn how to write their own songs, right? And we were like, we threw in a couple covers just for fun, but it was always like original focus.
Do you think that's like a lot of that is just like straight up like the fear of playing to nobody? Because it's like, if you play covers, you're guaranteed to get at least gigs that have some people. Do you think like that's probably the biggest thing? Because I would think it is just kind of
I
like
wonder. Yeah, good question.
scary to play your own stuff because you're probably going to play to nobody for a longer period of time, right?
And yeah, you're right. And then you probably get less money, right? We got paid way less than the cover bands, right? So,
Yeah.
and all these tribute bands, like they make good money, you know, but it's like that was never our thing. We never want to do that. And then the second thing is, yeah, we could have just relied on our friends, our local sort of following ish, but we didn't, right? Like there's so many hometown heroes sort of bands, but you got to go out and play to nobody. And then we did that early on. And that's like, those are the tough years. I mean, and for us, which we'll get into, but like that was like the next 6-7 years, you know, of playing before Scarecrows broke through, which was 8 years in. You know, we're driving to all these cities, and oh man, I mean, like those were looking back now, it's like I love them because those were built character and made us better songwriters and better friends and all that stuff. But at the time, I was like, I'm curious how you were, but it was like, it'd be depressing, one depressing show after the other, not the shows, but just the turnouts, you know, because I was having a blast on stage with you and Hicks, and, you know, it's like, you know, the shows were awesome, but just, it'd be like, okay, maybe tonight it'll be a full house. And then it'd be like, 10 people, you know, but those 10 people are like still our fans to this day. So we really did it. Yeah. You know, the cliche, it's like one fan at a time. Like that was us. We didn't really have any big shortcuts, you know?
Yeah. No, and absolutely, man. And I think like this is probably the timeline. Like we've been trying to kind of come up with ways to make these episodes kind of clean, like this era to this era. But I think this is the time. We might have a couple episodes that are in this era between like even this aggression and then Orange City and beyond, because there's like this nebulous time. And I know like one of our things, I may have already mentioned this, but like we'd be on the road and we'd always have like a bunch of like music bios, right? Because like it was always cool because you and I could get into heavy talks. We'd talk politics, we'd talk life and stuff. But like, man, after all those hours on the road, sometimes you just want to, you know, read Slash's bio and kind of shut your brain off. And the thing I always like, it just like always pissed me off. Really, like I was so frustrated reading these bios, and I'm glad we're doing this podcast because this point in a band's history, if they make it, is the time that they don't want to talk about, but it's the time that I think every band wants to know about. Like, how do you fight through this time where, like, you're right, we go on the road, and I remember our first show out of Saskatoon.
Regina.
We played Lethbridge.
Oh
no, it was Lethbridge. The Regina shows that we got booted out of, I think, were they were on the heels of the Lethbridge show, but maybe it was. I mean, it could have been either or. But I remember we played a club, and half of it was like dance club, and the other there was a little room for rock. And your buddy Craig. Krugsy, shout out there from day one. I think he was the only person in the room. A few people would like walk through, look disgusted at us, and then like go back to where the girls and the fun was. But I think it's this thing where it's like, you know, we could honestly sit here and tell like story after story after story. And honestly, you know, if people want to hear some of that stuff, we're happy to dig into it. But like, how you push past that, because I think like our whole career, especially once we broke through, people are like, how'd you do it? Like, how'd you get on radio? How'd you this and that? And I think like this is the thing that bands don't want to talk about, really, because it's, man, some of it was like, you know, it's almost triggering. You know, fast forward to whatever it was, we played a couple of shows in the US. You know, this is like fast forward like 15 years. To like 3 people, right? Like we got down there, we just wanted to do a couple things, and it was like I had this horrible muscle memory like of this era, right? Like, and it's a tough thing for bands because, you know, you drive, you're out of pocket for money. Like, you know, you'd come home and split nothing, you know, we just all go back into van maintenance. And you know, for me, I'm going to ask you, because I know for me, like I think I always had this blind, like, well, we're going to make it, you know, it's going to happen somehow. We'll figure it out. Like for you, like what got you through those days, buddy?
Yeah. Good question, man. Yeah, I think it was like, and maybe this is what separated us from other bands, is just like, we all have this like work ethic, you know, like you know, looking back, how many times could have packed it in so many times, right? Like we could have been like, and we got to tell the Regina story on this episode.
Oh, absolutely.
But like so many bands, I think would have given up.
Yeah, sorry, my bad. I'm so excited for you to tell that story because it is one of my favorites.
But like, and people say it's that prairie thing, that work ethic. I always thought that was BS, but maybe it is, because like how many Toronto bands or New York bands or Vancouver bands for sure would have given up, but we were just like, you and I knew we had something. And like I said a couple episodes ago, it's like we had we had great ingredients, just a shitty recipe in the early days in terms of songwriting. But it was like, yeah,
our cake used to fall in the oven all the time.
yeah, but yeah, exactly. We couldn't keep that cake up, but I think to your question, it's like, I think it was like, I thought we always would make it, and just had that sort of belief in, and that's the part you're right that you miss from like biographies. It's like, no one believed in, Jimi Hendrix when he was 15 years old, except Jimi Hendrix, no one knew who could become, how great he was, except him. Right. And that's kind of, that's what I tell like my kids, like only, what you can become, you know what I mean? Like, and I think I was with OBS, like we knew what we could become, but no one else did, the promoters sure as hell didn't, the venues didn't, the people in the crowd didn't, like we weren't that good. But I think you and I maybe had like this sort of idea of where it could get, and I think it kept us going.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that anybody successful has, and I've actually heard this. My wife Dana and I have talked about this quite a bit lately, about how there is a level of delusion like you almost have to have, because if you reason it out too much, and I think that's why like bands have asked. I know they've asked me, and I know they've asked you, like, well, how do you do it? Like, how do you break through? And some of it is like, it's literally like, well, if you look at this industry reasonably, you will get out of it. Like, it's not an easy industry. There's not money in it. Your chances of success are actually so low. I mean, there are, even in Canada, like we're a small country, but there are millions of bands here trying to do the same thing you're doing. And you need that level of like, honestly, it is a bit of delusion where you're like, well, it's got to happen. Like, and I think we always were like, and I think something that helped us that we probably, I know I got over in the beginning was like, and had to continue to get over, was like, you might have to like really start to learn the game. Because it was like, okay, radio doesn't want to play your songs. Like we'd go around to stations and, we'd come up with all these ways. Like you came up with that, we bought that little Cabbage Patch doll that we painted like, you were like painted, yeah, you were like painted like Gene Simmons. So I put like the Gene Simmons makeup on it. And, radio stations started to get to know us and love us. We'll probably talk about this next episode, like how we actually did break radio and stuff. But like we do all sorts of stuff like that. But we actually started to take lessons where it's like they'd tell us your songs are too long, they're too heavy for the radio. They're like, we learned the magic number is 3 minutes and 30 seconds to get on the radio. And instead of, I've heard other bands say this, and it's like your knee-jerk reaction is like, well, we're not doing that. Like we don't. And I think you and I had these conversations of like, if we're gonna do it, we don't have to like give in and become something that we don't want to be. So the choice was like, you're either gonna not change, not learn, and do like every other band and just kind of fade away and break up, and we've seen that a lot of bands come and go, or you're going to choose to learn. You're going to choose to say like, okay, well, how do we stay ourselves, become something great, but like we got to follow, not like follow these rules, but like we got to take the guidance. We got to like, and I think this will be where we go with the next episode, which is the years between this aggression moving into Orange City, which I think there was only 1 or 2 years in between. I don't 100% remember, but it was like we had to start learning some lessons, right? Like, and it's slow and it's hard to do because you have this like, we're rock and rollers. It's a fuck you attitude. You want to tell radio like, here's our 10-minute song, like, fucking eat it, and that's fine, but they're not going to play it. So, I appreciate that you were always up for these conversations of like, okay, well, what do we do? And I think we should end this episode with that as like, what do we do next? Like we toured and played, and we got to get into that. We'll start the next episode with the Regina story, because it was that and the Better Than Fred's story with the lemon wedge up in Grand Prairie that I think were kind of turning points for us in a couple of ways. So that'll be a good way to start off. But But yeah, man, I not to drone on here, but I appreciate like you and I and Hicks, like we would sit around and just say like, okay, what do we do? Like we want to be successful. What does that mean? You know, we want to get on radio. What does that mean for our songwriting? What does it mean for the quality of like the actual sound quality of our music, right? So, yeah, man, we should get into this in the next episode. I droned on right to the end of this one, but
No, it's
if
great.
you're up, are you up for starting the next episode? Like, let's go cold open right on that Regina story. I'd love that.
Let's do it.
All right, buddy.
Thanks for listening to One Bad Podcast.